On a warm morning in Accra, as thousands of ordinary Ghanaians gathered outside the Grand Hall to witness a new chapter in their nation's leadership, something unusual was unfolding inside. The crowd could not see it, but the cameras captured everything. There, beneath the bright lights and the echo of ceremonial music, Africa's president stood in line, shaking hands, smiling for the world, projecting unity. But unity was only a picture, one that would soon crack. As President John Mahama's inauguration began, IBRAHIM Traoré of Burkina Faso walked in with a calm, steady presence that drew every lens toward him. Soldiers in crisp uniforms trailed behind, and for a moment the room shifted. This was the young captain many Africans see as a symbol of sovereignty, a leader unafraid to speak uncomfortable truths. Then came the moment that changed the energy in the room. Traoré greeted President Paul Kagame, and then moved on. He greeted others, and moved on. But when he approached Kenya's President William Ruto, a man long accused by critics of prioritizing Western approval over African unity, Traoré did not slow down. He did not nod. He did not stretch out a hand. He simply walked past as if Ruto were invisible. The room paused. Cameras zoomed in. It lasted only a few seconds, but those few seconds told a story much bigger than the ceremony itself. Was this disrespect? Or was it a warning, a message from a generation of African leaders who believe their continent has suffered enough under foreign influence and the local politicians who enforce it? And for Americans watching, especially those of you who have lived long enough to see the Cold War, the rise of China, and endless shifts in global alliances, this moment raises an even deeper question. What happens when Africa finally decides who its real friends are without looking toward Washington, London, or Paris for permission? If this opening resonates with you, please stay with us. And if you believe that truth, raw and unfiltered, matters more than polished headlines, consider subscribing so this message can reach more people. Outside the ceremony hall in Accra, the voices of ordinary people painted a different picture from the polished speeches inside. Elderly Ghanaian men leaned on their walking sticks, mothers held their children high just to catch a glimpse of the leaders who were supposed to shape their future, and young men waved flags with a hope that felt both fragile and determined. For them, the inauguration of President John Mahama was not just a political event, it was a moment to believe once again that leadership might finally mean something. But inside the Grand Hall, a quieter but far more telling story was unfolding. As dignitaries filled the room, the atmosphere buzzed with the usual diplomatic choreography: handshakes, friendly nods, polite laughter. Cameras flashed, journalists whispered, and AU officials moved with an air of rehearsed confidence. Yet beneath the surface, there was tension, subtle, unspoken, but unmistakable to anyone who had watched Africa's political landscape shift over the last 3 years. Then the doors opened and IBRAHIM Traoré of Burkina Faso entered. He walked in not with arrogance, but with a discipline and gravity that immediately altered the setting. Dressed in his military uniform, accompanied by his security detail, he radiated something rare in today's global politics: an unyielding commitment to sovereignty. People in the audience straightened their posture without even realizing it. Some smiled, others whispered his name, and a few simply stared, as if witnessing a chapter of history in real time. After greeting President Paul Kagame and a series of other leaders, Traoré began moving along the line that had formed a ceremonial display of unity among Africa's heads of state. Cameras tracked him closely, anticipating the traditional sequence of handshakes, and then came the moment that would define the day. Standing ahead, waiting with a diplomatic smile, was Kenya's President William Ruto. To many in the West, Ruto is a key partner, a man who openly embraces Western ideologies, cooperates with NATO-aligned nations, and speaks strongly against military takeovers like the one in Niger. To critics within Kenya, including the Communist Party and opposition leader Raila Odinga, Ruto is a symbol of deepening Western dependency, from opening GMO imports to strengthening U.S. and British military footprints on Kenyan soil. To Traoré, he represented something else entirely: the very structure of foreign influence that new African movements are trying to dismantle. As Traoré approached Ruto, the room seemed to hold its breath. Security officers stood still. Journalists leaned forward. Some leaders watched from the corner of their eye. Traoré didn't stop. He didn't nod, didn't extend a hand, didn't even acknowledge Ruto's presence. He walked past with the same steady pace, offering nothing more than the silence of rejection. Ruto shifted slightly, as if preparing for a greeting that never came, but quickly regained composure, forcing a diplomatic expression back onto his face. It lasted only seconds, but seconds were enough. The symbolism was unmistakable, a leader who stands against neo-colonialism, refusing to offer legitimacy to a leader perceived as aligned with Western interests. No official commentary followed. The ceremony continued. Music played. Speeches flowed. But every camera operator in the hall kept replaying the same question in their mind. Was this an accident? Or a message? The footage reached the public within hours. Social media erupted across Africa, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, South Africa, even Kenya itself. In pro-sovereignty circles, Traoré's action was praised as an act of courage. In Nairobi, critics of Ruto argued that this was the international embarrassment they had long warned about. And among everyday Africans, the scene became a metaphor for the continent's growing ideological split. Because in that brief moment during Ghana's inauguration, something larger than two men was revealed. Africa is entering a new phase where loyalty, independence, and integrity are no longer abstract concepts. They are the lines leaders will be judged by. Outside the inauguration hall, as the noon sun climbed higher, the people gathered there still had no idea what had just happened inside. Mothers fanned their children with folded newspapers, taxi drivers listened to the ceremony on small radios, and young students shouted President Mahama's name with genuine excitement. But beneath their cheers, a wave of reactions was already brewing, because the moment IBRAHIM Traoré walked past William Ruto without a greeting had already hit the internet like a lightning strike. The video clip spread with remarkable speed. Within minutes, it had reached WhatsApp groups across West Africa. Within an hour, it was trending on Africa news platforms and Twitter-like networks. The images were simple: Traoré moving straight ahead, Ruto waiting with a faint diplomatic smile, then that smile sinking ever so slightly as Traoré continued without pause. Nothing needed to be said. The symbolism spoke louder than any speech could. And this was the exact moment where the story reached its emotional peak. For supporters of African sovereignty, especially those in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, the clip was more than an awkward interaction. It was a declaration. Young men in Ouagadougou posted messages saying, "Our captain fears no puppet." In Bamako, commentators described Traoré's action as a disciplined rejection of foreign interference masquerading as diplomacy. In Niamey, members of the civilian resistance circulated the video with the caption, "Africa is waking up." But reactions were not confined to the Sahel. In Kenya, the moment ignited a political firestorm. Opposition leader Raila Odinga, who had long accused Ruto of dismantling Kenyan sovereignty through GMO policies and deepening military ties with the West, seized the opportunity. His allies described the snub as international confirmation of what they had warned for years, that Ruto was isolating Kenya from Africa's emerging independence movement. The Communist Party of Kenya issued a scathing statement, arguing that Ruto's foreign-aligned decisions had finally been exposed on the continental stage. Meanwhile, Kenyan citizens themselves reacted with a mix of embarrassment, frustration, and bitter humor. Some wondered how their president, once seen as a populist champion, had drifted so far from the Pan-African cause. Others circulated memes comparing Traoré's silent gesture to a verdict passed in front of the entire continent. But the reactions from global audiences carried a different tone. In Western policy circles, analysts were quick to downplay the incident. Some framed it as a scheduling confusion or a moment of miscommunication. Western diplomatic commentators insisted that reading political meaning into a missed handshake was irresponsible. Yet the urgency with which Western voices tried to soften the message only made the symbolism more striking. And inside Africa's own corridors of power, the silence from some leaders was telling. Those who privately share Traoré's skepticism toward Western influence avoided commenting publicly, but their private advisors whispered that the moment would be remembered. Others, particularly leaders who depend heavily on Western funding, kept an anxious distance, aware that Traoré's stance resonated deeply with the African public. The true climax of the entire episode came not from the first video angle, but from a second clip released later that afternoon, a slow-motion version clearly showing Ruto leaning slightly forward, preparing for a handshake that never came. This angle transformed the event from a minor diplomatic slight into a continental symbol of ideological separation. And there was another undercurrent to the reactions, one rarely spoken aloud, but deeply felt. Many Africans remembered that Traoré had survived several coup attempts and assassination plots, rumors often tied to foreign intelligence interests. For them, his refusal to greet Ruto was not just political, it was protective. A man who believes foreign powers have tried to eliminate him would not casually embrace a leader widely viewed as aligned with those same powers. By evening, commentators across Africa described the moment as the first open fissure between two visions of the continent, one defined by sovereignty, the other shaped by Western alignment. The ceremony in Ghana was intended to showcase unity. Instead, it revealed the growing fault lines that will shape Africa's future. Outside the hall in Accra as the ceremony ended and people slowly dispersed into the warm afternoon, the reactions among ordinary citizens carried an energy of their own. Street vendors replayed the same 5-second clip again and again on cracked phone screens, debating its meaning with a mix of excitement and disbelief. A group of young men gathered around a small roadside television set pointing at the moment Traore walked past Ruto. An elderly woman selling roasted plantains shook her head gently and murmured, "A leader's heart reveals itself sometimes without a single word." What had begun as a symbolic gesture was now spilling into the everyday conversation of millions. But beyond the public chatter, the political consequences were beginning to unfold quietly, yet decisively. In Nairobi, the clip ignited immediate turbulence. Kenya's parliament witnessed an unusual surge of heated speeches as opposition leaders capitalized on the moment. Figures aligned with Raila Odinga declared that the humiliation confirmed their warnings. Kenya was drifting away from Africa's rising sovereignty movement. They argued that President Ruto's foreign-aligned choices had isolated the country at a time when African nations were beginning to assert independence from Western structures. On the ground, grassroots critics pushed the debate further. Smallholder farmers, already anxious about the government's decision to import 10 million bags of GMO maize, began questioning whether Kenya's food system was being handed over to Western biotech corporations. Civil society organizations renewed their concerns about new American and British military expansions in Nanyuki and Lamu, cautioning that Kenya risked being drawn into conflicts that had nothing to do with its national interests. To many ordinary Kenyans, Traore's refusal to greet Ruto did not feel like a coincidence. It felt like a verdict. Ruto's image suffered a subtle but unmistakable blow. On radio call-in shows, citizens expressed fears that Kenya was losing its strategic independence and drifting into dependency. Analysts on television warned that being perceived as out of step with the sovereignty trend spreading across Africa could diminish Kenya's influence in regional negotiations, AU security discussions, and Pan-African economic projects. Even some government supporters, while defending Ruto publicly, admitted privately that the incident exposed a deeper ideological divide, one not rooted in personal dislike, but in contrasting visions for Africa's place in the world. While Kenya faced backlash, the moment significantly strengthened the AES alliance in the Sahel. In Ouagadougou, the snub was celebrated as proof that Traore would not validate leaders perceived as serving foreign interests. In Bamako and Niamey, the clip was interpreted as a symbolic strike against those who condemned their military governments while aligning themselves with Western powers. For many young Africans frustrated with traditional leadership, the moment felt like accountability in its purest form, a leader refusing to hide behind diplomatic politeness. It reinforced Traore's role as the face of Africa's new anti-neocolonial movement. The African Union, an institution built on the idea of unity, now found itself exposed. The clip became a mirror reflecting the continent's growing split, one-side nations insisting that true sovereignty requires reducing Western influence even if it means supporting military-led transitions. The other side nations that maintain deep cooperation with Western allies and defend Western-backed notions of democracy and stability. Diplomats inside the AU quietly acknowledged that this incident would complicate future negotiations. Traore's refusal to acknowledge Ruto raised uncomfortable questions. How can collective security be built when leaders fundamentally distrust each other's alliances? How can Africa negotiate global deals when its own political family is increasingly divided? Perhaps the deepest impact was emotional. Across Africa, especially among marginalized communities, the moment rekindled a sense of dignity. It suggested that a new era was rising, one where African leaders no longer hide their principles behind empty smiles. A silent gesture had become a continental reckoning. On the streets of Accra, long after the inauguration crowd had thinned, a group of young men gathered around a small kiosk TV as evening news anchors replayed the moment, again and again Ibrahim Traoré walking past William Ruto without a greeting. Their reactions reflected what millions across Africa were feeling, but thousands of miles away in Washington and European capitals, the meaning of that silence was being interpreted quite differently. In Washington, analysts at think tanks and the State Department were among the first to react. Officially, they downplayed the incident as a diplomatic misunderstanding. But privately, the concern was unmistakable. The U.S. has invested heavily in Kenya's role as a major non-NATO ally, counting on Ruto to counterbalance the rising influence of Russia and China in East and West Africa. Traore's refusal to acknowledge Ruto undermined that narrative. It signaled that Washington's most trusted African partners were not necessarily respected within Africa itself. For American strategic planners, this represented a deeper problem if leaders like Traore, Goita, and Chiani continue gaining legitimacy among African populations. U.S. influence on the continent could face its steepest decline since the end of the Cold War. Some Washington commentators even admitted on late-night panels that Traore's gesture reflects a growing anti-Western sentiment the U.S. can no longer ignore. In Europe, especially France, the reaction carried a sharper edge. French outlets highlighted the moment carefully but nervously aware that Traore's popularity is tied directly to the rejection of French influence in the Sahel. European policymakers fear that if Traore's symbolic defiance spreads, more African nations may question long-standing military and economic ties. A French analyst put it bluntly on national television: "The danger is not Traore himself. The danger is how many Africans now see him as their voice." Germany and the UK took a more measured stance, but echoed the same concern: the balance of influence in Africa is shifting rapidly, and Europe might be losing the ideological battle. Meanwhile, in Moscow and Beijing, the moment was interpreted as a sign of opportunity. Russian commentators pointed out that the split between Traore and Ruto reflects a broader rejection of Western security models. China's state media quietly framed the event as proof that Africa is seeking non-Western pathways to development. Neither country directly celebrated the snub, but both observed it as a strategic signal that Africa's internal alliances are being reshaped, making room for partnerships outside the traditional Western sphere. Across the African continent, reactions were far from uniform. While Sahel regions praised Traore, several coastal nations more economically intertwined with the West chose silence. Diplomats from these countries admitted privately that the moment embarrassed the AU's attempt to portray itself as unified. But the bigger question that emerged, one echoed from Lagos to Johannesburg, was this: who speaks for Africa now? The answer no longer seems clear-cut. By walking past William Ruto, Traore unintentionally forced the world to acknowledge something Washington and Brussels have long resisted. Burkina Faso, though small in size, now holds an outsized moral and symbolic influence over Africa's sovereignty movement. For global observers, the incident was not just about two leaders. It was about a continent deciding whether it wants to follow the path of Western-aligned pragmatism or the path of sovereignty-first defiance embodied by Traore. A quiet moment in Ghana had shifted the global conversation. As night settled over Accra and the last echoes of the inauguration faded, something far deeper than a missed handshake lingered in the air. Ordinary people may have watched the ceremony with hope, pride, or curiosity, but across Africa and even beyond its shores, the moment between IBRAHIM Traoré and William Ruto had already become a symbol of tension, a symbol of awakening, a symbol of a continent standing at a crossroads. Because what the world witnessed inside that hall was not merely a personal slight, it was a warning wrapped in silence. It signaled that Africa is entering an era where gestures matter, where alliances are scrutinized, and where leaders who choose foreign approval over national dignity will no longer be shielded by diplomatic etiquette. And for many citizens of Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, and far beyond, Traoré's quiet refusal to legitimize a Western-aligned leader was not an insult. They saw it as a public statement. Africa must decide who it truly serves. But this moment also reveals something more troubling: a growing divide between African leaders themselves. A divide between those who prioritize sovereign control of resources, agriculture, security, and development, and those who continue to rely on Western models that have historically benefited outsiders more than Africans. It is a split that will shape elections, alliances, and even conflicts in the years to come. For Americans, especially those over 60 who have lived through the Vietnam War, the Cold War, the Gulf Wars, the rise of China, and the shifting tides of global influence, this moment in Africa should not be dismissed as a regional quarrel. It reflects a broader truth: nations everywhere are rethinking old loyalties. They are questioning who truly benefits from foreign partnerships. They are redefining what sovereignty means in a world where economic and military influence no longer guarantees moral authority. And in this global shift, Africa is not simply watching, it is leading. Through leaders like Ibrahim Traoré, whose name now circulates widely in Africa, many citizens believe a new era is unfolding. An era where small nations like Burkina Faso can challenge larger powers, assert dignity, and redefine their destiny. And in that struggle, every gesture counts. Which brings us to the essential question for today. Do you believe Ibrahim Traoré should have greeted William Ruto for the sake of diplomatic unity? Or was he right to make a silent stand reminding Africa that loyalty to the West cannot outweigh loyalty to its own people? Your perspective matters, and your voice adds depth to this conversation. If you feel you are among the first to understand these shifts and to recognize the meaning behind small moments that shape a continent, please share this video. And if you believe that truth deserves to be heard beyond headlines, politics, and media filters, consider subscribing. It helps amplify a message that many in Africa are fighting to protect. Thank you for watching, and until the next story, stay aware, stay curious, and stay engaged.